Hello, my name is Darren Thomas, and I am the Director of Educational Research Techniques. In this particular video, we're going to be learning about grouping students and some of the options and choices you have for that. So let's go ahead and see what we can learn. So essentially, when you're in the classroom, there's pretty much 4 different ways you can group or combine your students for the various learning experiences that you might have as a teacher. You can have whole class, you can put them in groups, put them in pairs, or you can have them work individually. So we're going to take a look at each of these, but we want to just kind of leave you with the point here in that you want to have a combination of these in your classroom. And how you use these depends on your teaching preference, the student's learning preferences, and that will change from year to year, month to month, or whatever. So you'll have different classes that will have different needs. And so we're going to learn a little bit more about that right now. So whole class is pretty obvious. This is probably the most traditional way of teaching students is through a whole class. So everyone together learning. So there are of course pros and cons with all teaching styles. And again, I want to reiterate or repeat how you have to figure out what works for you as a teacher, and you also need to figure out what works for your students as learners. So when you're doing whole class, some of the advantages of this is that it gives the teacher a high degree of control. So this can be important if you're having challenges with classroom management. You might want to move them from, say, group work or pair work or some other style of working to everyone moving together. Also, there are ways in which whole class can improve social cohesion because everybody is working together. Now, how important that is depends on the students and perhaps the culture. In some places, they expect whole class, and to put them in individual or group work or pair work is like not acceptable, not appropriate. Again, each teacher has to think about their own situation. And of course, the last one is like when it's preferred. I'm kind of overlapping here. It could be preferred by the teacher, it can be preferred by the students, or both. Now, of course, there are also challenges with relying on a whole class. And really, the only time one of these teaching styles will not work is when they're overly relied on, if you use it all the time. So if you over rely on whole class, here are some of the challenges you might see. Students become very passive because often with whole class, you're lecturing, they're listening. And again, this is not wrong if done occasionally, but when it's done all the time, it goes from students being active learners to just being passive, receiving information rather than creating. And again, this is only bad when it's out of balance or when it's not appropriate for the type of learners you're dealing with. Moving to the second one, it could be overly collective. So again, this is more about a cultural preference or cultural things. In some places, people want to be more individual, have their chance to go at their own speed, and they may push back on being in a whole class situation. And lastly, it can be difficult for shy students. If you're trying to lead a discussion with a whole class, the quiet ones are going to really disappear because they don't want the spotlight of everybody listening and staring at them. And so it's also in general harder for everyone to participate and interact, but it can be extra challenging for those who are a little bit quieter and maybe a little bit shyer in terms of how they go about socializing with other people. Now, our next one is group, and basically group is anything from a minimum of 3 kids, maybe up to about 9 or so, 9 or 10. I don't have research on that, but when you get much larger groups often beyond 7 or 8, it really starts to kind of break apart. And so when we put kids in groups, hey, some of the positives are collaboration and cooperation, able to work together. Of course, you get a lot of freeloaders at times, people who are in a group but not contributing. Also, when you have kids working in groups, it allows them to make decisions and to work out, confrontations and clashes on their own rather than having the teacher break up everything. And again, being able to manage conflict and deal with disagreement is a skill that everybody needs. Lastly, it allows for a role differentiation. So one person is like the secretary, the other person is the drawer, the other person is the writer. It just depends on the project. But people are able to differentiate and to focus on one aspect or one piece of the project rather than trying to do everything themselves. Now, there are of course challenges with group work as with any other approach to teaching. It takes a lot of organizational time. You have to really think about what you want from the groups and what you want them to do. And of course, when kids are allowed to work in groups, you're going to have a lot of noise and you're going to have some people off task. So the potential for off task behavior and basically chaos goes up as you step back as a teacher from controlling everything to empowering the students. Empowerment is going to lead to chaos. That is just part of allowing people to make decisions, because you're not just having them focus on the project, you're having them learn how to communicate, work together, collaborate, and these things are going to lead to conflict and disagreement and off-task behavior. So group work is beyond just the assignment. You're thinking in terms of how they interact with others and giving them opportunities to develop those skills as well. And then of course, now this is not as common as you would think, but some students actually prefer to work alone. So again, for the quiet, shy students, for the introverts, group work can be torturous. Now, it's not as common for people to prefer to work alone anymore, but there are still people out there who are wired that way, and this is where they're going to be exposed in terms of their weaknesses. So you can try to press it as a teacher if you think that's important, but remember, you're going to get pushback from the kids who want to work alone. And of course, moving to number 3, we have pair work. So pair work is obviously, one person working with another person. So 2 people in a group, if you will, a small group. And so there are pros and cons with this as well. So when students are working together, they of course require less guidance. When students need help, the teacher works with several students at a time instead of one, so it's more efficient. This also is related to group work, and that when the group is stuck, you're helping 5 kids at once, as an example, rather than 1 kid. And of course, just like with larger groups, it provides a chance to collaborate and to cooperate. Now, another benefit of working in pairs is that it's harder to, of course, not do your part because there's only 2 people involved, so it's easier to keep people on task. So I generally prefer either pairs or small groups when I want kids to try to develop their interaction and cooperative skills. Because when you start getting into larger groups, which for me, I define a large group as anything beyond 3 people, you start to get, they call it social loafing, where someone is not contributing. But with pairs, it's very hard to hide and not do anything because there's only one other person in the group. Now, of course, there are still challenges. It could be noisy, just like when you're working with larger groups. Kids talking, interacting, and just like with larger groups, people can get lost or off task. And again, going back to the quieter students, they often, have a despise working with other people. Although pair work, again, I'm speaking from my own experience, pair work is often more tolerable for the introverts and for the high achieving students who want to work alone, because there's just only one other person there, and it's harder for that one person to not contribute. And also when the groups are very, very small, when you have 2 people working as pairs, it's not as easy to just, for the brilliant student to just kind of fly away and leave everybody behind. It's easier for one person to keep up rather than to try to have 4 or 5 different people try to keep up with the really smart, brilliant student. It doesn't mean that this works every single time, but often this is much more doable for that quiet, introvert, high achieving student, or just quiet kid who doesn't want to work at all, to be honest with you. Moving to the last one, of course, this is another classic way of approaching teaching, and that is individual work. And so you make them work alone. Again, this is great for managing the classroom if things are getting chaotic. Break up the groups, break up the party, have them put their desk in rows and get to work individually. If they can't handle or control their behavior, it really works. And so some of the advantages of individual work is, of course, autonomy. That means they have to learn how to become independent, self-reliant in order to tackle the assignments that they might be facing alone. And of course, you can also adapt what the students are experiencing individually. So, okay, we call this differentiated instruction. This is your opportunity to give each student something unique to their own skill set if you have the time and the patience for that. Also, like I already kind of mentioned, is that having students work alone, it can be a great transition from high stress experiences. And what I mean from high stress is like, coming back in from recess, they're really excited, they're jumping up and down, when I was a teacher, we had like silent reading after recess to kind of calm everybody down. It allows them to do something individually, and they can get off that high of being out on the playground, as an example, or coming in from PE or from an assembly. You can use individual work to try to tone things down for the students and remove some of that excitement from coming from the playground, the library, the cafeteria, whatever the experience was that really got them worked up. Even after coming from a group project, the kids are really excited. They are interacting with each other. Some individual work to kind of calm things down before moving to the next group activity or whatever the teacher wants to do. Now, of course, again, every pro has a con, right? So you can see here that when you're dealing with individual work, you don't have those social experiences, which again, this is why all of these approaches that we're talking about, they need to be used together to give a student a full learning experience. Of course, if you also do a lot of individualized instruction, differentiated instruction, that can really increase the workload of the teacher to the point that it could be really, really heavy and challenging. So again, this might not apply every single time, but the major criticism of individual work can be that loss of that socializing experience. And generally, kids don't want to sit and be quiet for long periods of time. So like I've already said several times, you have to use all of these in combination in different situations and different settings to keep the kids engaged throughout the day. So to wrap this up, you can see here for yourself that there's essentially 4 different ways that you can have students, be grouped, for their own learning experience. And that could be whole class, groups, pairs, and individuals. So I want to thank you so much for, watching and listening. My name is Darren Thomas. I am the Director of Educational Research Techniques. You take care.